Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Leah, for that introduction and letting everyone know what's happening next at First Five this December, as we kind of wrap up 2024 at training at First Five, and I count it a privilege as always. Anytime they ask me to be present and be here, and if I'm available. So, like I said earlier, about a week ago, it felt like forever since I've been back here at First Five, but Leah reminded me it was just like the summer the last time I was here, but it felt like for forever. So I'm always happy to be here and happy that I think probably like 160 folk registered, and right now we have about 55 people that are on the call. And this one starts at 30 minutes after the hour instead of the top of the hour. And so that may have thrown some folk off who are used to the top of the hour. I just want to thank you all for showing up this morning and being here on this learning journey. I see some familiar faces. I see Tina Fleeton, who's over there at Bananas. Hey, Tina. Tina and I do some trauma-informed work once or twice a year with homeless families. So great colleague over there. And I see Helen, who I believe is with us today also. And lots of, I see Danny Terry. Hey, Danny. Wow. Lots of familiar names popping up in the chat. Okay, I'm going to stop that, Leah, because I will spend the next 30 minutes saying hi to people and getting sidetracked. And anyone who knows me knows that I love being sidetracked when it comes to connecting with other people. So let's jump right into supporting brain development in the early years. So for those who came to the first session in the series of brain development, which should have been the first one, socio-emotional, and kind of what most folk call challenging behaviors, which is the third one, but I like to call them behaviors that challenge adults. Leah and Catherine, we did a lot of thinking together, and that thinking together, redesigning, kind of like the typical, if you do brain development, it goes through some sequence of kind of technical learning. The same thing with social emotional learning, and even with sometimes the one around behavior. So we really tried hard to make sure that we were giving you some of those things that you can literally Google or find anywhere on YouTube. Lots of information on all three of these topics. So our push this time was to still honor that so often when folk come here to training at First Five, there are people who are new to their roles. Then there are people who are content experts. So folks show up here who are across the continuum. So I need to ask all of you to be patient because we have to present the information in such a way that it's brand new to some and familiar to others, and at the same time elevating for different groups of people. All right. So while there are some folk here whose names I remember and who are familiar with me, others may be brand new to training at First Five. So I'm Shawn Bryant. I'm going to be the facilitator on this brief learning journey today. Those are my god kids you see with me. That's Shola over my shoulders, that's Buhai, and that is Madison. And they are all Oakland Public Schools students right now in Oakland, California. So I have a few different roles in my life. I am their godfather, who is quite bossy to their mother and father, Jonathan and Tiffany. I'm also the director of YesToECE. It's a consulting, coaching, and training agency that I founded and ran. I'm also the director of professional development and adult learning at the Child Lab at Yale University's Child Study Center, where we train cadres of mental health consultants and coaches, researchers, and evaluators across the country with a tool that we use to help them understand the climate that we create in early learning settings that tells children and their families you're welcomed or you're not welcomed here. My other big role is I'm the pedagogical lead for Philadelphia Pre-K at Heaven's Angels. Meaning I'm back in the classroom. I'm back in the classroom, and I actually had a class observation this morning, and it was really different being on the other side, not being the observer but being observed was really, really interesting. So I'm from Philadelphia, PA. I've lived in Georgia for a number of years, and I spent 20 years in California before, during the pandemic, relocating back to Philadelphia. This is my 30 plus year in ECE. I like to say I'm bi-coastal because I visit California literally once a month to work and to live. So I'm flying from sister city to sister city every month. For those who don't know a little bit about me, I'm not going to read this screen, but these are the things that I find important or that draw me in easily in terms of early childhood. And I like to just say that the bottom one is real big for me, this notion of play. And how do adults in young children's lives, meaning parents, families, teachers, caregivers, help children in terms of facilitating play and understanding our role and responsibility, that our facilitation can help them sustain rich, deep, and engaging play. And my most favorite, how do we contend with, those aspects of play that remain unquestioned or that trouble us? And if you want to see what I'm doing in the world, I encourage you to follow me on social media. My divorce from Facebook over the last year, I guess we've reconciled because I'm back on Facebook and I'm moving slow there, but postings and Facebook Live events should be happening soon, meaning in the new year, with the help of these two young content creators that I'm working with, because they're really doing all the background work. Many of you know that I'm the contributing author of Trauma Responsive Family Engagement in Early Childhood and the author of Trauma Informed Practices, second edition. And I share that because, not to get you to buy the book, but in full disclosure, know that the proceeds of these books go to different early childhood agencies. So 4 times a year, every quarter, Parent Voices Oakland receive the funds from Trauma Responsive Family Engagement, and 4 times a year, Young Warriors in New Orleans receives the proceeds from Trauma Informed Practices, second edition, and I think there's a Butterflies program in Brooklyn that receives the proceeds from the first edition of Trauma Informed Practices. So I invite you in this virtual session to be prepared so that we can raise awareness about brain development, learn some new skills, and what, I'm using the 5 brain-based strategies from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. And we're going to reflect on notions of interactions, environments, and individualizing in the context of brain development in early childhood. So I encourage you to grab paper, pen, crayon, marker, dry erase, something to engage your brain. Because what the research tells us is when we do this, as much as Shawn loves to do this, it doesn't sustain me as much as if I grab a pen or paper or something to write with, and I take my notes this way with the pencil and write it. It actually connects to my sense memory and my brain in a deeper way in terms of my learning. My challenge is I have really, really poor penmanship. So I'm that person that can take copious notes, and literally at the end of it, when I go back to read them, there are going to be at least 6 times, if I have a page full of notes, where I say to myself, I have no idea what I wrote down. So I oftentimes, stop laughing at me, Vanessa Woods, I oftentimes have to type them so that I can read back what I wrote. But neuroscience tells us that if I really want to increase that learning process, if I do like this, it's really going to support me in a greater way. All right, so just a tidbit there for those of you who are trainers in the adult learning situation. If you're training center staff or other adults, this notion of writing can be really supportive. I went ahead and threw our community agreements together. Let's make this as bi-directional as possible, despite being on Zoom and seeing lots of black screens. I invite you to unmute and speak when it's appropriate. Always think about your role and responsibility in your experience and how this fits into your experience and how it can strengthen it. And be open to new ways of knowing, and this notion of what can I take back to my work? What can I take back to my work? So the quick overview is we're going to talk about this notion of what I like to call the amazing brain and uh, things about growth and neurons, networks, and flexibility, and probably a different way than you've heard in the past. Anchoring this notion of using the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework called the ELOF. We won't spend too much time there, but I'm going to introduce it to some. Many of you on the call I know work in early Head Start or Head Start, so you're familiar with it. And then we're going to go into this notion of the experience game, what I like to call the notion of relationships, connected relationships, and also if we don't have those things, removal and what removal means for the young brain. So before we jump in, I want to present what I call some foundational themes. Now, some of these, if you already pulled up your PDF of the slide deck, I realized after I sent it to Leah, some of your slides are in a different order because I hadn't moved them around. But they are there, but they may not show up the way mine are showing up here on the screen. So I want to start with the foundation around some things that we used to know, but some things that we now know. We used to believe that learning, this notion of learning, young children's learning, it happened at the kindergarten entry, at the school door of the kindergarten building in elementary schools. But we now know that learning begins at conception. And what I mean by learning is that when that sperm and that egg meet, learning begins. We actually have data that says actually 14 months prior to conception, 14 months prior to that egg and that sperm meeting, everything that that female has taken into her body shows up at conception. That informs brain development. Everything. We used to believe that it was either we promoted health or we promoted education, but this is notion of health and education that we now know need to work together like hand and glove. And the one that I like to share with people is this notion of, and Head Start does it, most people don't know why, that oral health, that brushing one's teeth and going to the dentist and having really great oral hygiene is a gateway to optimal health. And we know that when we're in better health, it's easier to access learning, i.e. education. So therefore they work together. And I often tell folks, if you ever meet an athlete, most athletes have really good oral hygiene. Most athletes, unless they're, MMA fighters and they're getting their teeth kicked out, or hockey players, but the vast majority of people who are athletic have pretty decent oral hygiene because it works together in terms of having overall health and learning and ability. And this last one I want to focus on in terms of we now know is care and education. We used to believe that, if we care for young children, it didn't mean we need to educate them. And those folk who believed that they were educators somehow believed that they were remiss of needing to care for young children. And we now know with so much work around relationship that we've always known, but it was during the pandemic that all of my friends and colleagues who do work outside of education, who are lawyers and doctors, public health people, even people who worked at libraries, they were all learning things that we always knew. They were all learning throughout the pandemic the importance of connection and relationship, connection and relationship, connection and relationship. And amazingly, it was reading that's new to most of them in terms of their work lives, but we've always known that they work hand in hand in terms of truly supporting young children. And then the last three that I don't have start, but they're just as important, to focus on 2 generational programs. We know that when programming shows up and it supports the adults who are charged with my care and education, meaning my parents and my caregivers, my family, it strengthens outcomes. And when there's this continuity instead of this fragmented kind of access from basically conception to age 8 is what we call the early childhood years. And someone just asked me a question the other day. She said, so why 8? She was like, why not 7? Or why not 9? She was like, I get people keep saying this, but No one ever says why it stops at age 8. So what most researchers believe is it stops at age 8 because it's at age 8 where there's another shift in brain development. And that shift is when most young children, notice I said most, not all, most young children kind of solidify moral development. So what we mean by that is it's usually around age 8 for most typically developing children. But some children get this at 7 or even 6. Some children, it'll be 10 or maybe 9. But what we find is, well, what their research found, I should say, is that most children at around age 8 can absolutely say this is a lie and this is true. Most children at age 8 distinguish between fantasy and real life with complete clarity. They're no longer clouding it. Most children at around age 8 know if they've told a lie and they know if they told the truth. Where with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, for those of you who work with them, you can actually tell their confusion because they'll talk to you and you'll say, is that right? And they look at you as if they're saying, I think it is, but now I'm doubting myself. That's where that place of age 8 comes in and why age 8 is the end of those early childhood years. Oh, I see Julie Rosita. Julie Rosita's over at Family Fast. Hey, Julie, I haven't seen you in a couple of years, girl. It's good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you for cutting your camera on. Mwah, mwah, mwah. And this notion of place-based versus seeking services. And any of you who are on the ground like Tina Fleet, you know that when you're working with families who are in transition, that when they can access a multitude of services in one place, it actually heightens the fact that they're going to come back, that they're going to get their needs met instead of having to get on the bus 4 times to go to 4 different places to do 4 different things. We actually know what those things don't happen for families. And oftentimes those things at the bottom can disrupt the 3 at the top if the ones at the bottom, which I call, if they aren't in place richly around what we should be doing in 2023 and 2024. So my last foundational slide around changing the brain, and I'm being clear around these are teaching strategies, parents and families, community members, nurses, public health folk, education people, anyone involved in the life of a child or even an adult for that matter. We need to be consistent with what we're doing if we're teaching, meaning we need to do it daily. So think of this as becoming a new habit. We need to do it intensely. So if I'm at home, I'm thinking of what's the rhythm of my house? What do our days look like? And I'm trying to insert learning during that period, fun learning that doesn't feel really constrained, that's unconstrained. In that school, learning is oftentimes constrained when we think of schedules and routines. It should be done broadly, meaning if we want healthy brain development, that all the adults in the house should be doing positive things in terms of their relationship and their interactions to build those brains of young children. And then it should be done with what? Multiple strategies. Because the research says if I do one thing, over time, that one thing will probably increase if I'm doing it repeatedly. But when I do a number of things, and if Leah does a number of things, and if Leah's partner does a number of things with their 2 children, and if all 3 of us are doing these things, what we find is the brain change happens quickly and is sustained in a positive way. And this notion of accurately, this one sometimes confuses folk. So, there's this thing that they use a lot of times in elementary schools, and I see it being used more and more in early childhood programs. They're called brain breaks. So I won't take a deep dive into it, but if you did your own little study on brain breaks, they tend to work, but the science behind them isn't really robust. So this notion of, are we doing it accurately? When it comes to brains, there are some things that we know fundamentally work, and there are some things that seem to work and we don't know why. We do know that oftentimes if we're doing things to change our brains or young children's brains, we need what? Multiple opportunities and experiences, meaning over time. On the short end, we need about a month and a half. if we're thinking of weeks. On the long end, we need about 3 months to sometimes see those changes of doing things to support optimal brain development, right? And some of it, we don't know why. So here's this interesting part that Bruce Perry talks about. So Bruce Perry, I was on a call with him at the very beginning of the pandemic, and he shared this notion of 2 months after children are born, 2 months. And he really said, like, we see this difference, and here's what we believe, but we still need more what? Evidence. And he has a huge amount of children in his database. Now, the vast majority of them are children who were placed in foster care. They've kind of grown up in the foster care system, and they've tracked a lot of them. But they found that in terms of brain development, those children who 2 months after birth, who stayed in chaotic households, right? 2 months after birth, but then maybe they moved 5 months after birth into a stable household, and now they're 14 or 15. Compared to children who 2 months after birth, they were placed into a very stable and enriching household. And it could have been the one that they were born into, but for whatever reason, they were moved later. And maybe they moved into a house where the family or the parents were more, free will, pessimistic about things. And they didn't really have a lot of hard boundaries and limits. And the children could kind of had what they call free range parenting. They actually found that one group of children thrived and the other stumbled. This is interesting because it's brain development and it's 2 months after birth. So they found that children 2 months after birth who were around sustaining, enriching adults who built their brains in a safe, supported way could be moved into houses that were not so organized. They didn't have rhythms. The parenting was kind of chaotic. That as those children's brains begin to grow and express, that what was dormant at 2 months, but at 14 and 15 begins to express itself in the what prefrontal cortex of the brain, was really related to what happened at 2 months. So even the parenting later could not disrupt what was placed at 2 months, because that's the dormant part of the brain. So our brains develop from the back to the front and from the bottom up. Children who 2 months after birth were removed from the home because it was too much chaos or trauma or abuse or neglect. And it could have been at month 3 or 4, placed into a very stable home. As their brains begin to express themselves later, guess what was lying dormant at 2 months begin to express itself, what they experienced at 2 months. So that's what I like to call the amazing part of the brain and things that we have to know. That doesn't mean that those children who experience those harsh realities at 2 months are facing a life of gloom and doom. Of course not. Does it mean you may need to lean in some more? It just might be. My baby brother, who is now, actually his birthday was 2 weeks ago, who is literally now 29, who we've had since he was an infant, was removed from a traumatic experience at birth. And as a 29-year-old who works, but there's been some struggles, despite how enriching and supportive his home life was. There have been some struggles that when I heard this research, I went right back to my youngest brother and thought, wow. So this is why he probably shows up this way at times, because he wasn't, with my mom at 2 months. He came a few months later to live forever. But Bruce Perry's research says 2 months after birth is a critical period. Then before and after, there's something about 2 months after birth that is highly, highly critical. And we're still learning about that. So for those of you who work in early Head Start or in places where there are infants, we don't need you to go and assess them all around what happened in their life at 2 months, but it could open a window for us to have more knowledge of. We may need to lean in with what we like to use the word intention around what we do and how we do it and why we do it with an individual child, opposed to I'm doing the same thing with every single child. That's the big takeaway there. All right, so I'm going to stop for just a minute. So this is what I call a question of impact. So you can unmute, you can put your answer in the chat. What part of your body has the most neuroreceptors? What part of your body has the most neuroreceptors? Martha said the brain. Okay, that's a good answer, Martha. I like that. I see. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait. Somebody. Wait a minute. Somebody. They all stopped moving too fast. It was like that waterfall. Martha said the brain. Jellica said the brain. Here we go. Michael Lewis said the hands. Ashley said the stomach and the gut. Helen said the fingers. Jamila said the brain. Jackie said the hands. So it looks like Mike Lewis, who is a good colleague and friend of mine, and then it was Helen who said fingers, but the answer is your hand. Your hand has the most neuroreceptors. So think of it. Remember earlier when I said this strengthens the capacity for what my sense memory for me to recall and remember when I write? The same thing is true for young children. So Montessori is known for this quote around a child must first have it in their hand before they have it in their brain, meaning what we investigate, manipulate, discover, and become fanciful about, if we have the opportunity to place it in our hands and do all of those things with it, I like to call experiment with it or learn with it and from it, it actually has a foundation in brain development. So it is our hands, or as Helen would say, our fingers, right? So thank you all for that. Yep. All of those answers are great. All of those answers are great. So Bernadette, there's actually some great research, but I left it out of this because I'm still learning about it in terms of trying to go deeper about the eyes, that our eyes and if you want to learn more about it, just go to he's at Stanford, Dr. Mike Huberman did a great kind of expose on it around in utero, our eyes are actually a part of our brains. And as the brain develops and as that fetus begins to develop, space goes between them, but how initially in utero, our eyes are literally a part of our developing brain. So this notion of what we see in the impact on our brains is ever evolving. But I don't want to Bernadette, go down that path too much, but I thought it was really enlightening for us in early childhood around what do we have access to, what do children see, what do they experience after birth, but that notion of still being connected in this way as the beginnings, eyes being a part of the brain and what they're finding out about that too. So for many of you, you're familiar with the ELOF, but for some, it may be a brief introduction, and it is a brief introduction. So the Head Start framework, that's also known as the ELOF, this describes the skills, the behaviors, and the knowledge that educators and adults, I like to say, should be fostering in young children. They say from birth to 5, I like to say 5 and under, right? Because we know some things that around even before birth that we can and should be doing. And this includes here dual language learners, children with disabilities, all are considered, because it also considers this piece. This is why I actually like the ELOF, when they added this notion of developmental progression, because it really pushes adults not to say this child is 3, they should be doing all these things. It says across this continuum, developmental progression for many children who are chronologically the same age usually show up and do things the same, but not always. So it forces the adults to see children across this continuum at what I like to say at potential. So it shifts this deficit mindset. If we see all children at potential, regardless of where they are, then it's forcing our brains and our thinking to see them from what a strength-based perspective that we can still support in terms of overall brain development. So in Head Start programs across the country, this framework that we see on the screen, it kind of guides their curriculum selection, it guides the implementation and the assessment, that cyclical process, because it helps in terms of planning, assessing their teaching, and the learning experiences that all children have that's supposed to lead towards what? This notion of school readiness, them being more ready for school, ready to attend when they get to the kindergarten door. While I am a fan of the ELOF, I am, and I make no concessions about that, it's missing an aspect when we think of whole child development. And the aspect that is missing is what we call the spirit domain. In most textbooks, we learn about the domains of learning, but we're still missing the most important one in my belief and understanding. And it's this notion of the spirit domain. So the term spirituality, most of us know, is derived from the word spirit, right? And the spirit means the vital force or principle that's the emanating force that's within all living things, right? And Ruth Wilson talks about that. And in one of your handouts I gave you from Ruth Wilson, I'm a fan of Ruth Wilson. But then there's some others that I want you to consider. So one of the researchers talks about spirituality is a vital part of human nature. A whole child teaching approach must include the part of the child some call spirituality. Again, this isn't that notion, Bananas used to often have the spirited child workshop. They were really talking about behavior. We're not talking about behavior here. We're talking about whole child development and this other thing that's not religion. So don't confuse it. That's not religion. So Truesdell says that and defines spirituality as the capacity in human beings for wonderment. Sounds nice, right? And non-threatening. For interest in the nature or origin of things, and from considering how one is related to others, to oneself, and to the world around us. I like it, but it still seems somewhat incomplete. So there's a third one I want to share. And this comes from my godmother, Dr. Patricia Nunley, who some of you may know. She says that each person is connected to a single energy source that allows us to connect with the past, the present, and the future. So this third one is this one that is really an African worldview. That this belief says that this spirit domain is energy, right? Where the Western that we all learn is that, we look at matter and quantum physics, but this has nothing to do with religion and is not spirituality. This third one is about spiritness, that everything is made of matter or energy, which is the spirit, the human body. This notion of connected to the past, the present, and the future as part of my development and part of my brain development, an aspect of whole child development that's being talked about more and more as potentially something that's left out. So I want you all to be on the lookout, because the whole session isn't about this, but pay attention, because I guarantee you in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to hear more Western people talking about the spirit domain. But trust and believe, they didn't create it. It actually came from African philosophers, African educators who've been talking about it for centuries. But people are accessing it now as a core missing component to wonderful frameworks like this that are still missing a piece. And this isn't about, some people that say, well, Shawn, isn't this an aspect of approaches to learning? Nope. It's completely different. It's its own domain, because none of those talk about the connection to energy and other people, particularly in the past, the present, and the future. Let me speed up a little bit here, Leah. So there's some mindsets that I want to guide us so we can jump to this brain piece. That all children are individuals with different paths of development and rates, and we've got to consider them individually and unique, regardless of their prenatal environment, their temperament, their physiology, and their life experiences, that all what impact their brain development, right? That these children come from caring families, they have supportive educators and other adults who matter in their lives, but we all have to be responsive and supportive in our interactions as adults, because this is essential to their learning. So you all heard me say I was, back in the classroom. So there's one little kid who he actually has an IEP, and he comes with some presenting challenges. Like, he literally changes the tenor and tone of the classroom every day. Every day. And of course he comes to school every day. In the other day, I realized that, when they're eating lunch, he's usually not eating. And, he's, trying to spit his milk on someone, falling on the floor. Like, all of this is true. And I realized he was sitting there and he was talking to the kid beside him. And I kind of called his name and I gave him the thumbs up and I said, wow. And I called attention to the fact that he was doing the right thing. He didn't know how to take it. It was just too much for him to receive. And he put his little 4-year-old head down and literally didn't want to put his head back up. And in that moment, I realized that one of the things that I needed to do around being supportive was beginning to call out those behaviors. They were going to be hard to locate, but to call them out, that thing that we know. But it was in that moment I realized I don't do it enough, that I needed to work harder in terms of our relationship in shifting his brain's interactions with me. So this notion of families, we've got to respect them and support them as a primary influence in their child's early learning and education. And this happens through knowledge, through skills, their cultural backgrounds, that all lead up to school readiness. And this help is the help that they define as needed and necessary, right? A lot of my families are younger than myself, and they live on their cell phones. So I'm always searching for nice apps that they could use to help them learn how to engage and interact with their child or children. And the two go-to ones that they all seem to like are Ready for K. It's free to them. And the Varoom app. I prefer Ready for K. Boston has Boston Brains or Brain Building. I've downloaded that one also. There are a bunch of free ones out there, but it gives them access to, here's this concrete thing you can do with your child right now. 2 sentences, go ahead and do it on Monday. Wednesday, here's something else you can do to build on that. Friday, continue to expand on it. And when I talk to them, they talk about that they're using these things. And this is that everyday aspect of brain building strategies, where we're not just providing these kind of conceptual and theoretical parts of the brain, but saying, when you do this, you're building your child's brains deeply and richly through your interactions with them. So we all know, what we hear about it, that nurturing, responsive, and consistent care helps create safe environments. So I state that because it's in all the early childhood literature. Everyone talks about it, but it's actually difficult to achieve because many people who still care and educate young children were not parented or taught this way. So this notion of becoming nurturing, becoming responsive, and being consistent is a skill that they have to learn. But first they got to unlearn the other aspects of what they brought to it. And that's something that those of us who work with adults don't bring forward enough for them to understand, that the new learning requires some unlearning. Because what I find is often the new learning is faced with, I've already learned something and I don't want to change what it is I learned. So therefore, young children's brains suffer. So here we're talking about this notion of all skills, or any skill, any behavior or ability involves multiple areas of development. 20 years ago, we would talk about like right brain and left brain, but the reality is our brains are highly, highly integrated, and that oftentimes one experience for a young child actually lights up multiple areas of their brains. This integration is important for us to consider. So this notion again about adults being intentional and focused on how children learn and grow, how they learn and grow. I'm talking about active children who are engaged and eager learners, that effective teaching practices build on what's intrinsically occurring in young children. And most of us talk about that happening through what? Through play. Here's our final mindset to hold on to. This notion of diverse strengths rooted in their family's culture, background, language, and beliefs. Language and beliefs. Probably the most difficult, but I believe the most necessary, right? Our responsive and respectful learning environments should always welcome children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, because effective teaching demands it. Effective practice demands it, right? That we should be building on those unique backgrounds prior to each child, that are unique to each child as a part of their brain development. All right, let's jump in. The amazing brain, growth, neurons, networks, and flexibility. We're going to use the chat for this. Just take about 30 seconds. What is the brain? What is the brain? Julie says a network, matter, muscles. I love that one. A mainframe, control system of the body, Ashley says. Thank you all. Any more? Intelligence, Jackie says. A control panel, a processing center. These are all educators. CPU, the center of controlling, the organ in the body, which controls bodily functions. Central processing center, emotions, Mel says. Motor skills, the main hub. Look at that. Complex, Estrella says. The commander in charge. I love it. All right. It's all of those things. An organ, Deborah says. It's all of those things and more. So let's listen to a short video around how the brain develops, grows, and learns.
86 billion nerve cells, 100 trillion connections, 7.6 billion manifestations, zillions of things that could go wrong. Isn't it surprising that in the majority of cases, our brains turn out just fine? Let's take a look at the processes that allow this complex organ to grow and function smoothly. Brain development, and therefore learning, begins in the womb. By the time a child is born, the major brain structures are already in place. But brain development doesn't stop at birth. The best is yet to come. As we grow up, we first learn basic and then increasingly complex skills. This is possible because the different regions of our brains mature and become more and more specialized. And while we learn, brain connections are constantly being formed and modified. Many factors influence this process. In the beginning, our genes play the most important role for assembling the structures in the brain. But as the brain's development continues, our environments and the stimuli they provide become more important. Eventually, our genetic makeup and environment work in tandem to determine how the brain performs. During the first 3 to 4 years of life, perceptual and sensory systems in the brain become specialized and lay the foundation for functions such as language, social behavior, and emotion. Everything that goes right or wrong during these stages of development has consequences. But because brains are resilient, not every harmful factor will lead to dysfunction, nor does the brain need only positive experiences to function properly. Whether early adversities disrupt brain development depends on our personal dispositions just as much as on our environments. brain development reaches a major milestone between the ages of 22 to 25. By then, most areas have fully matured. But after that, our brains are far from static. They continue to learn and change throughout our lives. The rate of change may vary, but the process never ends. The human brain, a spongy mass of tissue that consists mostly of water, is indeed the most complex object in the universe.
All right, those are from our colleagues at the blog on learning and development. So I selected this one because they centered the brain in the womb. And when I first saw this video, I thought, oh, this was reminding me of Ron Lally. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's an ancestor now. But I had the pleasure and the honor of meeting Ron years ago at a PITC event. And he was following me around and he ate breakfast with me. And we had really great conversation. And this was years before I even thought about working at YesToECE. He was literally talking to me, trying to see about where I could fit in. And I want to say this had to be 10 years before I even ended up at YesToECE, but he was talking about womb building. I'm trying to think which book, For Our Babies, I think it's somewhere in here. But this notion of womb building and what happens in the womb around brain development, because we get so focused on, what happens in the brain after, birth, simply because our brain is the one organ that after birth is continuing to what? Develop and grow. Where all of our other organs, unless something else has happened, their size might shift a little bit, but they're fully developed, where the brain is continuing to develop. I won't get too much into that because there's still some controversy around it. If you, I'll share this. So if you go to the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and I think I may have said this to this group before, or a First Five group, they started these podcasts at the beginning of the pandemic. If you go to podcast number 1, about 23 minutes in, or go to right when Jack Shonkoff is introduced, there's these 3 women talking in the beginning. He comes in probably the last 8 minutes, and he talks about the brain and how magical it sounds to say, oh, the first 5 years of life, and those first 3 years, and how he always calls people on it and says, well, if you talk to a 90-year-old and say, what did you do yesterday? And they tell you what they did yesterday, that's brain development, because they can recall it and articulate it, in that we're talking about it in this way that's a little bit not really what's happening. So I'm not going to go too deep, but I want you to listen to Jack, because it shifted everything for me when he presented that in that podcast. It's the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. So if you just Google Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, it's going to pop up at the top of your search. And when you go there, if you go down to all the resources and you click on podcasts, go to podcasts and go to the first one. There's an introduction that says, we're about to start this podcast, not that one, the actual first podcast. Towards the end, Dr. Jack Shonkoff comes in and he talks about the fantasy of what we talk about in terms of brains. But nonetheless, I think he positions us to begin to talk about this more richly and accurately as we move forward and get more information. So I share that with you because I wanted you to really get this notion of womb building and what womb building means. So I won't dive deep into this part. This is that technical part. But our brains have different functional and structural regions. Those regions are called lobes, and each lobe is specialized for a particular set of tasks. I won't dive deep into that because we were trying hard not to spend our short time with too much of that. So I want you to watch what the mom does, and think about the areas of the brain that are activated in this short video. Watch what the mom does and think about what areas of this child's brain, if you're familiar with it, possibly are activated, or just the language that you might use.
Let's go. People have studied how parents and their children interact from a behavioral standpoint for 30, 40 years. But you could only wonder what's going on inside the baby's brain.
Did you just switch it?
Now, for the first time, we can actually visualize functional activity with the MAG machine. Off the baby brain is coming a literal tsunami of data. We can create a movie of the brain reacting as parents talk to their baby.
Oh, he got the bunny.
What really makes us human is the fact that we are social creatures.
Oh, there's more bubbles.
We're proving that babies need social stimulation to learn. The social brain is the gate for learning.
Down.
When Francesca's in front of LaMarcus and she's talking,
The ball clap together.
the motor systems that will eventually be able to talk are activated.
Pia, pia, piano, 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 pia, pia, piano.
But then we have her do something asocial. She looks down at her cell phone. She's not talking anymore. No auditory signal, no social signal. It's just gone. This is LaMarcus's brain.
Stimulating their brain to see the science behind it.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing.
This is my baby's brain.
Yeah,
And it's working. And it's developing. And soon he's going to be talking with his sister-in-law.
Everything that you're doing with the baby
You say thank you.
is building that brain. And it's the two of you who are turning it on.
We talk a lot.
You do. It's clear. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Like my daughter says, kiss your brain.
Yeah, kiss your brain. That's a great phrase. Well, kiss his brain. It's beautiful.
Yes,
Really
it is.
beautiful.
Thank you. This is amazing.
So that question around, what do you think Francesca did in terms of brain development, in what areas of the brain that were potentially activated when you watched her interact? What are some things?
I was observing how she said the word piano and then was mimicking playing the piano. I don't know, maybe that's teaching, you know, the baby the name of the word and maybe how to, like, the symbol or like the movement for it. I don't know, that just caught my attention.
Awesome. No, that's definitely one. I'm gonna put some things, these are all possible responses to just kind of guide our thinking in that limbic region. And we didn't go over the regions on purpose just for the sake of time, but look at all these answers, responses, I should say, popping up. Definitely. Talking and interacting with the baby, speech, social skills, reciprocal speech, talk, read, sing, fine motor skills, connecting actions to words, a safe place. Orlando says a safe place. Wow. Social emotional expression, vision. So what you all don't know, there's some backstory to this family, and they're actually in another video. They're actually homeless. So they're housing insecure, some might say, or in transition, others might say. And when you watch this video, had I not give you that background information, because they're actually in a different video that centers 5 families who are struggling with housing insecurity, domestic violence, and other ruptures in life. But when we look at them, there's nothing that would indicate that that's their reality. Yet, what's present here? The interactions related to what? Brain development. Martha said nurturing relationships. So regardless of position or station, families can still engage their young children for healthy and optimal brain development. It's a big takeaway there. If we had more time, we would unpack this some more around those interactions. And we're not going to go deep into this, the notion of brains in, what I call each region of the brain has a language. The bottom of our brain, which is where our brain stem is, that red part, the language of the brain stem is sensations. The language of our limbic system, in the middle of the brain, is feelings and emotions. And the language of our prefrontal cortex is words, in terms of expression and how do we build capacities in that. And for those of you who have come to other sessions here, you know that there's a whole session on each one of these parts of the brain in terms of its own training. So we know that young children's brains go faster in the first few months and years of life than they will anytime other. And we see a visual representation here of what that looks like. So somebody mentioned the nervous system earlier. We know that brain development begins long before birth, and that's something we want to really understand. In fact, what we actually know is the first stage of brain development, the formation of the nervous system, begins within the days of conception, right? The days of conception. We know that our nervous system is the body's communication team, right? Someone used this word earlier, networks. They say that they're networks of neural connections form information superhighways. Anybody that's read any of those Harvard reports know that all this language is coming from there. Then they go on to talk about this notion of rapid communication between the body and the brain drives every single motion, intention, and thought. It is this network that allows young children to learn and adapt to their ever-changing surroundings, right? This early formation of the nervous system begins before most females know they are pregnant. Remember we said conception, when the sperm and the egg meet, and at 14 months before conception, at conception, everything that female has taken into her body shows up. I actually learned that from Ron Lally, to speak of him again. I'm paying attention to time, Leah, so I don't want to stay here too long, but I'll move on to the next one. In terms of neurons, we know that neurons make up our nervous system, and they transfer signals to other neurons through structures called synapses. A single neuron may make thousands of synapses with other neurons. So this is that part of neurons and brain development, or I like to call brain building. So the science says, we all learned this in science class. Once the signal reaches the end of the axon, it triggers the release of chemical messengers at the synapse. These are called what? Neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters travel through tiny space between neurons, and they stop or dock in special receptors on the receiving neuron synapse. This initiates a weak electrical signal, right, in the dendrites of the receiving neuron, and the process begins again and again and again and again. Then there's this thing here called myelin sheath that wraps around it. And what we know is each one of those makes it denser and denser and denser in terms of supporting the charge of what happens. This other thing about our brains, before we get to connections, is actually our brains really want to remember, and our brains enjoy shortcuts. So I left it out of here because I was considering the number of slides I had. But if you've ever been to a park, and you've seen, like, here's the cement path that we're supposed to walk on, or the rock path that we're supposed to walk on, at many parks, you'll notice there's this other path that it's like, whoa, human footprints were here. And over time, there's no more grass that grows, and it's its own path. It's a shortcut. So you're not walking on the cement, you're walking on where grass used to grow as a shortcut. That's exactly what this does over and over in the brain, because the brain wants to create a shortcut to get us there so that it uses less resources in terms of getting us to our desired destination in terms of connections in our brain. That's what brings us here. We pay attention to the fact that neurons never work alone. Each neuron is part of a network of other neurons. These neurons have different jobs in a child's brain. Some connect to just a few other neurons, while others connect to thousands and thousands of other neurons. What scientists say is that typically one neuron will make many connections to other neurons. Regardless of whether neurons connect to one or many neurons, the average neuron makes about 7,000 synaptic connections. We're all born, meaning every single child is born with the most neurons they will ever have, about 86 billion. I'll say that again, 86 billion. So let's imagine for a moment that each of those 86 billion neurons then has to make 7,000 connections with other neurons. That's huge, right? I think it's incredible in terms of synaptic development that has to occur. That has to occur. They estimate that in our cortex alone, meaning the most evolved part of our brain, there are about 20 million neurons. And those 20 billion neurons, and those 20 billion neurons make about 1 trillion synapses per cubic centimeter of cortex. So you're gonna have to do the math there to see how much that is. Although we are born with most of our neurons, our brains have not yet made all of these trillions and trillions of connections. This is the important part here, connections. This allows us to learn new things continuously and become experts at living our lives. It starts in early childhood. So I've heard one person say synaptic development is sort of like a forest of young trees or saplings. All the trees are there, but they are small and they haven't filled in all their branches, right? Neurons grow in similar ways. As the trees of neural connections grow, they mature into a dense network of connections, the ecosystem of the brain. Scientists believe this is a good thing because the connections forming in young children's brains are the result of what they learn and the experiences they have. When you learn something new, you're shaping the way neurons in the brain share information. Hold on to that. Share informations. So think of blooming, pruning, and thriving. Like a forest of trees or bushes, some pruning is necessary to maintain a thriving brain. The brain prunes synaptic connections by reducing the number of connections it has. Listen to this part, because this is where many people get confused. The brain keeps the frequently used connections and eliminates the infrequently used ones. So you hear that old saying, we use it or we lose it. So the brain is paying attention, saying, here's this connection, but it hasn't been used. It's not connected to anything. So let's go ahead and mow the lawn. Let's get rid of this to make space for what? More frequently used connections, right? That blooming part. So let's move to the next part, the experience gain, relationships, connections, and removal. So if we go back to this notion of blooming, pruning, and thriving, think of connections that we need and use as being kept, right? Connections that we don't need, the ones that are actually making it more difficult for a child's brain to function, are removed. Connections that are making it more difficult for a child's brain to function are removed. This process is like a blackberry bush, if you're familiar with the blackberry bush, that is healthy and thriving. The branches or connections that remain are strong and the brain is more efficient. It's more efficient. Throughout brain development, though, there are multiple periods of blooming and pruning. They call them bursts in the literature, occur at different times and in different regions of the brain. Scientists think that these bursts of blooming and pruning align with, here it comes, sensitive periods, Helen. You know, Helen's a Montessorian, so she's really familiar with that term, sensitive periods in the brain. These sensitive periods are times when brains are particularly open to new experiences and new learning. Sometimes you hear it talked about as windows of opportunity, windows of opportunity. So I like to say, because I don't want to use the word hard, because it takes a lot to always know when that's happening and is almost impossible. What we need to do is give children what ongoing and continuous positive interactions and experiences with engaged, positive adults. I'm going to be real intentional about that. So let's think of nature and nurture in our final time together. You know, the physical characteristics of a child's brain in terms of them being born with just one side of how the brain grows, this notion of, you know, attributes. And if you go into like psychologists and researchers who've kind of researched this around environment and heredity, this quote, I think, sums it up on the screen. Heredity deals you the cards, environment plays them. Heredity deals you the cards, environment plays them. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's use the chat, or you can unmute. What comes to mind when you hear this quote? Heredity deals you the cards. This is in reference to brain development. Environment plays them. Nature and nurture.
We're in a game of high stakes poker.
Okay, talk to us some more about that, Mike. Talk to us some more.
So you like, again, I mean, I'm not a poker player like that, but just knowing, like, just playing a game of cards, you're handed the cards, and then and then with on the table or on the board, or how other people play things, we react to them based on what's in our hands. Therefore, that becomes the environment that we're in. So if we're, you know, amateur or novice in any sort of game, right? And we're handed a deck of cards that we, you know, was handed to us blindly. We look at them. We then in turn have to react based on what's being played, or based on what skills or what things that were given to us at birth. And so, but at the same time, you play the wrong card, it could be detrimental or problematic to the outcome of the game for you. So I see it high stakes poker in that way.
All right. Brittany put something in the chat. Helen did also. So nature is our inherited genetic characteristics and tendencies. So nature would say that my mother had 4 children, but she gave birth to 3. All 3 of the children she gave birth to, these 2 teeth, all 3 of us lost. Some might say that was a genetic characteristic. That how did all 3 of our children lose the same 2 teeth? Nurture refers to the environmental conditions that surround a person. Here's an example. Nature is my height, my weight, and my hair color because they're a direct result of my DNA. But my nurturing results in my actions, my political views, or even my clothing. So the one thing missing in this quote is the interaction between nature and nurture goes both ways. Certain characteristics inherited through my genes or nature, and the way that those genes or characteristics are expressed can change depending on my environment growing up as a child. Children's developmental outcomes evolve through the interactions between their genes and the environment, right? Not solely one or the other, which is what used to be believed and espoused. And now we know that it's this interaction of them both having an effect on each other. So here's another example of a child's physical characteristics like height and weight. These have strong biological determinants, but are also influenced by environmental factors such as nutrition, environment, toxins, and physical activity. Physical activity. So I'm gonna share something with you. And this is why that Jack Shonkoff thing is so powerful for me around brains. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I really just was working from home and I loved it. I love being able to just stay home, not have to go out in the cold or the hot. They would deliver my groceries if I want. You know, I could leave when I wanted to. Here's something I actually realized, that once I started leaving my house every single day to go back into that classroom, my body started to feel different. Because I was spending most of my days doing like this, I was beginning to lose the strength in some of these fingers. At one point, I thought I had a stroke. I did. I went to the doctor and they said, well, you didn't have a stroke. And, you know, this is a little bit of arthritis there, you know, you're half a century old, a little bit, you know, you're old, Shawn, was what my doctor kind of told me. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just have to, you know, live with this. I bought compression gloves, started going back into the preschool classroom, meaning I was moving more. My environment had changed. Now I have a standing desk. I'm standing up. I'm, you know, in my office at my home. At one point, I was using the walking treadmill under the desk until I slipped. So it's over there now. But I knew I needed to move, but I was still struggling in terms of this finger and this hand, in terms of feeling like I lose strength. Change the environment since September and back in to that learning environment, moving and thriving around a bunch of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. My hand actually feels fundamentally different. I no longer struggle with feeling like I'm losing the strength because I changed the environment, meaning I started moving my hands and my fingers differently without even realizing them. And I realized one day, I was like, whoa, my finger feels different. I attribute it to the change in my environment. The same thing happens for young children in their brains. So something that you all may be familiar with in terms of hearing is experience shapes connections, that those neural connections change as the result of experiences that we offer young children. And to a large extent, which connections form between neurons and how strong those connections are is based on our experiences. And for young children, it's based on the experiences that the adults in their lives, their homes, and their communities offer them. Because their developing brain is establishing, I'm gonna use this word again, a network of neurons for them to work together. So the more often we offer young children experiences, the more neurons involved in the processing experience begin to work in unison, right? So we all heard the saying, some people say neurons that fire together, wire together. Other people say cells that fire together, wire together. The idea here is that more often, certain neural pathways are stimulated, the stronger the neural pathway becomes. Now, here's this other thing. Sometimes these neural pathways that are stimulated are not stimulated in a positive way, which is why I keep intentionally using the term positive connections. Because you can offer me negative connections as a child, and guess what happens? My brain starts to create a pathway for that. And then if someone else comes along and they start to offer more positive connections, those positive connections will lay on top of the other one that I'm no longer using. But guess what happens? During times of stress, during times of threat, that other one that's dormant, it doesn't get pruned. Because some people think, well, that other one got pruned. No, baby, it's still laying there. It's waiting for that moment, that opportunity. And then it pushes that positive one away. And then that negative one surfaces back up. So that's literally what happens when we think of negative connections and positive connections, which is why you often hear them saying one negative connection needs 5 positive connections to combat the effect of those negative neural connections that some children have been afforded, unfortunately. So here are 2 terms I want you to get. Experience expectant. Experience expectant. How many of you have heard of this term before? Put it in the chat, yes or no. experience expectant. Okay, I'm seeing lots of no's, Leah. I'm waiting for a possible yes. All right, looks like most folks still here with us said no. Wait a minute, Jamila said yes. All right, I'm not gonna put you on the spot, Jamila, but we got one yes. Veridel says, I believe I have, that's two. All right, another no. Did everyone put something in the chat? Experience expected. Okay, so it looks like the vast majority of folk here with us, Leah, are saying this is a term that they're familiar with. So there were two scientists, William Grinnell and James Black. They said that, well, I should say they describe the way that the brain makes connections by lumping them into two main categories. The first one they called experience expecting synaptogenesis. That's the big, $20 word. Yeah, these two scientists describe the process of the forming connections in the brain based on the experiences which typically are afforded to developing children and what we expose them to. For example, they said that the visual parts of the brain expect or require exposure to light and patterns to form those current connections in the brain. Really, the brain is pre-programmed to collect this information and form the appropriate connections in the brain, right? That the exposure during early childhood to these types of environmental input or the experience is required for typical brain development. This is, exclusive of extreme circumstances. Every child will form these connections without intervention or need for extra stimulation. Experience expectant, right? So I like to say, the researchers talk about light in those natural things, but for us on the ground, experience expectant is, we're no longer saying sit and get. This is, I need to move to learn and to thrive. I need to move, I need to be social to thrive. That I expect to do that as a young child. This notion of children should be seen and not heard and sitting quietly. This counters those traditional notions. Then there's this other part, experience dependent. How many of you have heard about experience dependent? Yes or no? Put it in the chat. Okay, we got some no's, we got a yes, some no's, a nope. I love that, nope. So this second kind of category around connections that Grinnell and Black refer to of experience expected synaptogenesis, they say that this process is described by connections that form in young children's brains as a result of unique experiences that all children have in their lives. For example, we all learn to speak different languages. And that the more exposure that we have to a particular experience or set of experiences, the stronger connections between neurons become. Now, it seems like logical, right? That this is true of both positive and negative experiences in our lives. But this process begins at birth. The experience that you offer children shape the way their brains are connected and set the stage for the rest of their lives. For the rest of their lives. When we do that well, we do something about children being experience dependent. We set the pathway and the stage for them to become active learners. Active learners. This means that children are active agents in their environments. This is not about them being passive and waiting to be taught. This is about them being explorers and scientists of their own environments that they can act on in the world. So I say that, and I say, this is actually the most difficult part, because this is why play is such a contention. And I'm dealing with this now. We have some children in my class who have behavioral supports from an outside agency, and they say, these children just play all day. And then I get a little ticked off and start talking about how sophisticated play is, and start telling them what I've observed around their play and what these children know and whether their learning lifts, and then they get real quiet. But I realize I silenced the conversation, and they're not learning anything as the other adults who are there to support them, because they want me to sit them down at tables and give them ditto sheets, because they see that as like the only form of learning. All right, I'm paying attention to the time, Leah, so I'm going to speed up. So then I would be remiss if I didn't bring in epigenetics. So we won't take a deep dive in this, but this is the field of study that looks at, mechanisms that regulate the activity of our genes, meaning how our genes are expressed. Epigenetics, may provide insights as to why environments that we grow up in as children have lasting effects on our brains and our bodies, And then there's some people who are taking epigenetics into all these other places around like bias, and how epigenetics for them is dictating if I walk into a room and I've never met someone before, and my epigenetic print can make me say, oh, I'm not going to sit with that person, because they're taking this all different kinds of places. I had lots of questions in the training, but I think this is interesting around what we're continuing to unpack around epigenetics. But up until recently, researchers and scientists thought that very few environmental factors influence the expression of our genes inside our bodies. But more recent scientific findings continue to indicate that the experiences we have as children and the environments that we grow up in can and do influence the expression of our genes inside of our bodies. In addition, these changes can be inherited and passed along from one generation to the next, So if we think about that metaphor from earlier, the way the environment plays you the cards can impact the cards your children are actually dealt, right? So this is one way that we can see the influence of culture on brain development. As children's cultures shapes their experiences of the world, it can also have an impact on how their genes are expressed. So an important takeaway here before the next slide is that not only can our earliest experiences around how these connections form in our brains, but also how they affect some of the genes and how they express throughout our lives, which can have a long-term impact on our health and behavior. So in short, some genes can be activated and others inherited through epigenetic changes, all right? Through epigenetic changes. This slide really is just like the epigenetic players. Some are called writers, some are called readers, and then others are called erasers. I won't spend a lot of time there. And then one of your handouts is what is epigenetics. And I borrowed this handout from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. That's true, Ashley. This notion of trauma-informed care, and there are some overlaps, but I really was trying to steer clear of bringing in a bunch of trauma stuff just in the short period of time, but definitely agree with you, Ashley. So in short, we're about to wrap it up. I want to offer one more short video to you in the sake of what we believe what videos introduce in terms of concepts. This is not, there's a colleague of mine in Oakland who was talking with it, and he was like, I think people who show videos and trainings are just being lazy. And I went on and we had the conversation, and he's someone who actually doesn't train, and the 2 times he trained, he did a really like bust up job, but I'm gonna keep my judgments to myself. But he had a lot to say as someone who doesn't train. But he's a friend of mine, he's a friend of mine. And I say that to say, this isn't my attempt to be lazy, but I think there's some crucial information here in these 5 steps for brain building that's also in one of your handouts.
Did you know that you can help build a child's brain? Everyday interactions can have a big impact on developing brains throughout childhood, starting even before babies can talk.
Scientists call this serve and return. Like a game of tennis or ping pong, a child serves by showing an interest in something, and the adult responds in a supportive way.
Finding moments throughout the day to do it is easy and fun, and you'll be building strong brains. You can use 5 steps to practice serve and return with any child. Step 1, share the focus.
When a child is interested or curious, you can see it.
What's this? It's a stroller.
Watch this child look at something in a book, right there. Pointing shows interest.
Cow.
So does making a sound, like this child. And mom is paying close attention.
See baby moving those little arms and legs and focusing on the ball? That's a serve.
The key is paying attention to what the child is noticing.
Oh, you like those guys too?
Look at Grandpa sharing the focus.
By noticing serves, you will help build curiosity, and you'll strengthen your relationship.
Step 2, support and encourage.
You can return a child's serve by saying a word of encouragement.
That's right. Pretty good.
Watch Grandpa return this serve by saying thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Even a facial expression can encourage a child.
Orange.
Or emotion, like this mom dancing.
Time.
You can also pick up the object that the child is pointing to and bring it closer.
We need help to sit her down.
Things like helping and playing with the child let them know that their thoughts and feelings are heard and understood. Step 3, name it.
Yeah, the puppy. See the windows, the house.
When you return a child's serve by naming what they are seeing, doing, or feeling, you make important language connections in their brain.
He's got bumps all over him, huh?
This brain building happens even before a child can talk or understand your words.
You can name anything: a person, a thing, an action, a feeling, or a combination.
Clean up, everybody do your shit.
When you name what a child is focused on, you help build understanding of the world around us and what to expect from it.
The baby's sitting. Ooh, the baby's sitting in the back seat of the car.
You like those? Those are raisins. You have raisins all the time.
Naming also gives a child words to use later and shows that words are important to you.
Step 4, take turns back and forth.
Taking turns helps children learn self-control and how to get along with others.
Waiting is crucial. When you return a serve, give the child a chance to respond.
How are you? I'm good. How are you?
Note that the caregiver waits here for the next serve.
See this toddler navigating a new adventure? Grandpa is waiting patiently, returning serves by asking questions and then waiting to see what happens next.
Yeah.
You want to cover it?
Yeah.
Are you cold?
Yeah.
Oh, put this over your lap like this, okay? There. Do you like that?
Yeah.
Oh.
By waiting, you give the child time to develop ideas and build confidence and independence.
Step 5, practice endings and beginnings. Children signal when they're done or ready to move on to a new activity.
Watch how this child shows it's time to start something new. Letting go of a toy signals an ending. Then picking up a new toy signals the next beginning.
Want to play with the giraffe?
Sharing the focus is important in this step.
Ooh, the big eagle.
Because this mom is sharing the focus, she notices when her child is ready to end one activity and begin something new.
When you can find these moments for a child to take the lead,
Want to try this one?
you support the child in exploring their world.
Would you like to play with something else?
And make more serve and return interactions possible.
Sit there.
Serve and return interaction is critical for a child's developing brain. And the best news is that you can do it anytime, anywhere, without any need for toys or technology.
Look for small opportunities throughout the day, like while you're making a snack or while you're grocery shopping. What matters most is that you're doing each of these 5 steps. Notice the serve and share the child's focus of attention. Return the serve by supporting and encouraging. Name it, take turns going back and forth, and practice endings and beginnings.
Serve and return interactions make everyday moments fun and become second nature with practice. Try practicing with a child today.
Sorry about that, Mike. I saw your message, but with Zoom, when the video is playing, if I start typing, it's going to make the video stop. But here they are for anyone that missed one. And I will go ahead and right now, so I don't forget, add the link to that video if anyone wants it from the Centering Developing Child at Harvard. Let's take some time to, oops, wrong slide. A brief discussion, and by discussion, I mean a series of, you can unmute and use the chat. When you watch these kind of 5 brain building interactions, what do you think children are learning from those types of experiences? What do you think children are learning from those types of experiences? Martha, did you unmute to speak, or was that an accident? Estrella said social skills. Okay.
I'm so sorry. That was an accident.
No worries, no worries. Learning what to expect in the world, role modeling, relationship building, vocabulary. What I love about this is these 5 center everyday social back and forth interactions of being supportive of brain development. And this process through experiences every day, meaning parents and families, adults being able to access something that costs no money and that's accessible to them in their daily interactions with young children. So this doesn't say, oh, you're doing this wrong, you need to fix this. It simply says, here are 5 concrete ways to what? Interact and engage with young children that can build brain development. That's what I love about it. So when you saw that being presented in the video, what might you change in terms of the experience to support children in any way? Ooh, Orlando said the environment of energy. I like that one. What might you, what would you change those experiences in any way to help support their learning?
Orlando on Stack. I would change, show not too much trauma, but show the different side. So when they do see a different side, they don't grow up be mentally challenged on certain situations as a child.
Okay.
As far as being disciplined, hey, don't touch the fire. Some parents might talk to them. Some parents might spank them, but show them both different degrees on how this can affect your growth through life.
Thank you.
Over.
Helen says waiting for feedback from the child. I started reading this article. I didn't finish it, Helen. They were talking about feedback is love. So I was reading it with this smile, like that I had to force to myself because I showed up reading the article with a lot of judgment. which is probably why I didn't finish reading it. But I love this notion of waiting for feedback from the child, and that sometimes the feedback might not be what verbal or auditory. It could be complete silence, in that is feedback. And sometimes we push, we want all children to show up the same way, and we'll say the child isn't saying anything, and we forget that that child's silence is a concrete response to an experience or what's being afforded to them. But how do we anchor ourselves enough or resource ourselves enough to notice that and to show up in this way that I know I mentioned it last week for those on the call, this notion of observation is our number one teaching strategy as adults. Not oftentimes in the literature, we kind of, I think, spotlight two things. We spotlight scaffolding and reflection. And I think we overemphasize those, but one, I don't think can scaffold well if I don't observe my child or other children well, in terms of knowing that if I observe them, the experiences that are offered from the observation will support it, right? Thank you for that, Helen. Waiting for feedback from the child. And our third question for consideration here is, what impact does the child's culture have on their daily experiences? What impact does the child's culture have on their daily experiences?
Hi, Shawn, this is Julie. Can you hear me?
Hey, Julie, yes, again.
Culture can have a lot of experience. A lot of people don't realize that children can be, based on their experience, be bilingual even before they can talk, can understand in different languages. They might not necessarily speak the language, but in essence, their interactions are actually speaking the language.
Definitely. That's so true. So you reminded me of this notion of receptive and expressive language, and how in very young children, particularly children before the age of 3, that they're not parallel, meaning they don't show up the same way. In that the University of Chicago did research a number of years ago on 2-year-olds. And what they found was that over 85% of those 2-year-olds expressive language, meaning what they say to the world compared to their receptive language, what they hear and understand were not parallel, and that their receptive language skills, meaning what I hear around me from my family and the adults who care for me, I actually understand that 12 to 24 months past what I actually tell them. That's phenomenal. So if you think of the cultural considerations there, we give toddlers the short end of the stick, that because they're not expressing verbally this understanding, what they found was more than 80% of them understand 12 to 24 months past their chronological age what is being said. We know that in the brain is because, up until it's usually closer to we get to 3, our memories are stored in our amygdala, our fear center, and then they shift to being stored in our hippocampus, which is why most of us cannot remember being 1. Even though people often say, I remember being 1, Shawn. That's not everybody. And I often say, tell me the story. Every single time, if you go back to first 5 training, because it happened live on the training, all 3 people unmuted and wanted to challenge me, and all 3 of them articulated a traumatic experience. I wanted to say, y'all remember it because you just talked about being bit. You talked about being burned. That's why you remember the experience, because it was so traumatic. But the vast majority of us, and I'm being intentional with my words, cannot remember that, because where our memories are stored, and it shifts as we get older. And what researchers believe, or neuroscientists, is with that shift comes the advent of more expressive language. So when that happens, most children at 3, but with most male-born children, it's about 3.5, that language, meaning what I say to the world and the people around me, they begin to understand, and it's matched with what I understand. And there are so many cultural considerations around that, around how children are reared, what their family and their communities believe and understand of what's passed on to children at different spaces and times, and what isn't, and how what those experiences shape and form connections in the brain. So I think when I connect what you said, Julie, to what Helen said about the feedback piece and waiting for the child around giving them feedback, there could be multiple and numerous cultural considerations there that are at play. And if a child is in a situation that doesn't understand that, we'll say, well, this child won't respond, or they're not talking, and they're not, doing all these things that are very Western constructs. We end up placing the limitations on them immediately, and sometimes attribute it to intelligence or understanding and say they need to be assessed, when we miss the finite pieces of the cultural considerations of experience and brain development. Wait a minute. Okay, it was a lot happening in the chat while I was talking, Julie. Well, Helen said, I come from a music-loving family. I surround myself with music and love to dance. My children know. Right, that experience of music, right? Mm-hmm. That's right, Vanessa. Rearing practices and discipline practices can create those positive and negative neural pathways. Tina says culture can be a learned behavior. Definitely, it depends on how, because not everyone defines culture the same way. And if you were to if you literally go to the American Psychological Association, the American, Anthropological Association, the National Education Association, the National Medical Association, they all have different definitions of how that group defines culture. And then if you actually talk to people who do that kind of work on the ground, or talk to cultures around the world, all of them define it differently. So this work of culture isn't, here's this blanket that all of our brains are having the shared experience, but it's this understanding of, wait a minute, these children received a different experience growing up, so their brains formed and took in information differently. And sometimes that could be what my Western raising sees as positive, they could see as negative, or what I see as negative, they might see as positive. I've run into this oftentimes at my work with Yale when I train consultants who work on reservations around the country. There are 3 pieces in the tool that oftentimes, if they're paying attention, someone raises their hand and they say, this one here, in the tool, it's seen as this way, but on the reservation, it's actually considered differently. So that's this cultural consideration that we have to take in immediately in using that tool to affect climate, ultimately what the connections formed in brain development.
I just want to share. We had a parent in one of our classes a while back, and she came to this country from another culture, and her son was 4, got him into Head Start, and she thought that he had some kind of developmental issue happening, but it was because when she got to this country, she didn't realize, oh my God, my son used so many words. But here, it was okay for the child it was encouraged to express. And the whole time, this child, because they spoke in her own country, English and her language, but she thought he didn't, for some reason he wasn't speaking, but that was a cultural thing. He comes here, and she was amazed that her son knew so many words in both languages, because here she was using strategies like serve and return, talking with him, curiosity questions. She was just, it was just a very interesting situation where culture could play a big part of that piece in child development. And sometimes we don't even know, and so I just thought I'd want to share that.
Thank you. All right, and thank you all for sharing so much in the chat. I wish there was a way when this gets posted on, I guess Zoom hasn't done that yet, posted on YouTube, that what happens in the chat kind of shows up. That's the one thing I like about when people do those YouTube live recordings, everything that happens in their chat, if you go back and watch the video on YouTube, you see everything that was happening in the chat as part of, well, you can as part of the recording. So let's finish up our short time together, and thank you all for hanging in there. I know it's usually 10 to 1, but today's was 10:30 to 1:30. It even threw me off at one point. I was like, oh, I have more time. It's not ending at the top of the hour. But I'm going to wrap it up with what I call brain practices. And these brain practices center around this notion of interactions, environments, and individualizing. Yes, Leah, 30 minutes after the hour. So literally what you see on the screen, so I'm going back to my friends at Head Start. I'm not going to read to you on the screen, and your copy of the slide deck, it's a PDF and it's full pages, so you'll be able to read these. But this notion of brain practices using interactions as a foundational consideration, considering our environments, we know that the environment plays a part in what brain development, this nature nurture is not either or, but they interplay with each other. And then when we get past the environment, this is where culture comes in. How are we individualizing? How are we saying this is who this particular child is, and this is what we need to do and can do to support their brain development? So at the end of the slide deck, you'll see a series of these interactions for different ages, environmental shifts and considerations, and then how we can individualize for a child's brain. I don't want to read these to you because they're self-explanatory, but I feel like this is such a great resource for those who may or may not know about it. And it comes from our friends at Head Start. And I'm going to put in the chat right now, Leah, two great links. And one is for folk who have iPhones, and one is for folks who have those things called Androids. And you can see where my preference lies by my language. My brother would disagree with me. But if depending on which one you have, you can go there and there's this awesome Head Start link that you can download, and it's called the eLoft to Go. Are you familiar with that, Vanessa? eLoft to Go. It's an app you can download. You can give it to your Head Start folk. You can tell parents and families can download it. It's free. And literally what I just had across the screen, it considers the child's age, and then it talks about interactions, it talks about environments, and how we can individualize for that particular child across all of those domains. I would say my one and only, what's the word I want to use here? I want to be careful with my language. My one and only, Jeanette said she has it, or do you use it often, Jeanette? Is that there is no spiritness domain. There's no spirit domain there, but hopefully with continued collaboration in time, that one missing domain of spirit can and will be added there. But it is easy access, really easy. If you actually use your phone that way, if you haven't, I could encourage you to play with it, to consider interactions, brain building, and individualizing with a child or group of young children. So as always, Head Start, First Five Alameda County needs your feedback. And we always close with, in the chat, one takeaway from this session and how you plan to integrate brain building and strategies into your work with children and families. I want to thank you all so much for staying, for your participation, for your desire to have a learning lift, to understand brain development in a practical way where it's not just all technical, and for you engaging this morning or this afternoon in these 2 short hours. So thank you all, thank you all, thank you all. And we'll wait for the messages in the chat. One takeaway from today's session, and when you fill out the evaluation, you'll get your PD certificate, and you'll get a link to the recorded video and all the handouts if you haven't already accessed them. Thank you all.